Hello, my name is Ian Smith. I'm at USPED Read for You. I am talking about the book of Nassim Taleb, which is called Antifragile. This is the successor to his now famous book, The Black Swan. So how to live in a world we don't understand, that is the theme. And how to deal with risk management at all levels, our own individual level and at the level of society. His interest is in applied probability and risk management. That is his academic background. He's interested in the role of high impact events, and he wants to provide us with rules for decision making to shield individuals and to shield society from what he called black swans, which I will define in a moment. A black swan is an extremely rare event. It's got a severe impact. So positive examples, which would have been unpredictable, the internet 30 years ago, unthinkable 100 years ago, Google, the success of J.K. Rowling's. There are negative examples of black swans, the market crash in 87, the bank failures in 2008, pandemics, one of my biggest fears for black swan events, the demise of the Soviet bloc, very unpredictable, and if you think of a probability distribution, they're not even in the tails of the probability distribution. So he then argues that it illustrates a very severe limitation to our learning from observations and experience. And he calls it then the fragility of our knowledge. Now he introduces what he calls a family of disorder. And the names uncertainty, variability, imperfect knowledge, change, chaos, volatility, entropy, time, the unknown, randomness, turmoil, stressor, error, dispersion of outcomes, unknowledge. These are the things that introduce risk. And he calls them a family, and whenever we talk about risk or we talk about uncertainty, we're actually talking about this whole family of things. And now he defines, and this is the heart of the book, he defines the so-called triad. 3 different types of outcomes that you can observe. What we usually, the fragile is harmed by this family of disorder. The resilient can resist the shocks and can remain the same afterwards. The anti-fragile, which he is proposing as a solution to the problem of risk, is that things will thrive when it's exposed to this family of disorder. So the more you stress the system, the better the system becomes. The more uncertainty and volatility and randomness you enter into the system, the stronger the system becomes. And the purpose of the book then is to build a non-predictive decision-making model, which is based on measuring fragility. How do we decide when something is fragile or not? And which can then be used to reduce fragility or to harness uncertainty. So he says the simplest way of discovering whether something is fragile is, he says, anything with more upside than downside from random events is anti-fragile. And he says that if you have a system now which is inherently anti-fragile, then if you deprive them of volatility and of stress and of randomness, you will harm them. For instance, if you don't use your muscles, you will suffer from muscle atrophy. He argues that if you run systems, bureaucratic systems, which is only top-down policies, whether it is for a large company or whether it is for a country, you're going to cause something which may be anti-fragile to become fragile. He then argues that whereas top-down processes tend to be fragile, if you devise processes which are sort of bottom-up, many of them will thrive under stress and disorder. They can discover, they can innovate, they will progress to, and he used the word anti-fragile tinkering. For that, read sort of experimenting on a daily basis, feeling your way to a solution. So he builds a strong case for aggressive risk-bearing rather than formal education. He says you're wasting, if you want to be a good businessman, you are wasting your time at the business school, you're wasting your time at a university. You should be out there in the trading pit on the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And then throughout the book, he builds the case of Mother Nature. And he says that Mother Nature is anti-fragile. She was designed that the whole evolutionary process is anti-fragile. And that is the best manager of black swans. It says if you're in corporate employment, you work for a bank, you're extremely fragile. Although you don't think so. You think, I've got a day job, I'm being paid to go to the work at 8, I go home at 5. My future is secure until the day you're fired. On the other hand, he said robust is probably a dentist and a dermatologist, because whatever the conditions around us, people will have toothache, aches, and they will have problems with their skins. And he said antifragile is a taxi driver or an artisan. Taxi driver is quite used to having variable incomes from day to day. So if the general conditions around him should change in the middle of a recession, then he will just, he can move his taxi to wherever the business is. Political systems, he says the nation state, the centralized nation state, is a finite entity. He says the robust political, the anti-fragile political system will be one which is a collection of city-states, one which is governed in a totally decentralized way. And he uses the example of Switzerland. Knowledge, he says academic knowledge is extremely fragile. On the economic sphere, bureaucrats are fragile, entrepreneurs are anti-fragile. If you have minimum wage earners, they're much more robust. They don't care that much. They will survive if there's a little reputational slip. Medicine, he argues a case, he says fragile is additive treatments. If every time you go to the doctor, he prescribes medicine, you're becoming fragile. But he says for most problems, subtractive treatments. It says take away medicine, drink less, eat less, that sort of thing. Stress, you become fragile when you're chronically stressed, and we all know that. Anti-fragile is acute stressors. We must experience some stress to make us operate optimally, but you have to take time to recover. At its heart, nature is very clever. Nature has got built-in antifragility. And it says examples are, you have over-insurance in nature. In the human being, you have 2 kidneys, you have 2 lungs, you have many systems doubling up, being redundant to cover yourself against fragility. But now he says risk management. We focus on the worst outcome in the past. He says that's a great mistake. We look at the past when we talk about the 50-year flood and the 100-year flood. I said, not realizing that the next flood is not going to be anything like a 100-year flood, but it's going to be a 200-year flood, once in 200 years. So the worst outcomes are not in the past. Then this topic of how you benefit from stressors, from mild stressors, is you need continuous repair and maintenance, non-complex mechanical systems. Complex systems are self-healing to a large extent. Mechanical systems hate randomness. They were not designed to deal with that. Complex systems loves variation. In mechanical systems, there's no need for recovery. In the other one, there is need for recovery, etc., etc. The other interesting one is mechanical systems, you wear them out when you use them. Complex systems, they will age when you do not use them. Same as the example of atrophy. In order to deal with this fragility, you don't have to predict it. It is just that you must understand that there is fragility. And the test for that is to look at your downside and to look at your upside. And if there is an exposure that you can take, a high-risk exposure on the upside, that's a sign of antifragility with a low exposure on the downside. Do not try to measure the risk. Try to understand what the risks are, and whether you're fragile or whether you're antifragile, and then put in the position that will make you, that will cover those risks, but at the same time leave you with an exposure on the upside. But when he addresses the ethics of risk management, it says you call it skin in the game. People managing, for instance, should have skin in the game because it mitigates fragility. If you're on a plane and the pilot is on the plane, then you know that the pilot has got skin in the game. The pilot also wants to land, so therefore it should be as safe as is humanly possible and under the control of that pilot to deal with the plane. So he says, talkers have a free option. And he says, really, in life, you should not have an opinion on something if you're not exposed to risk, especially not an opinion which is going to influence the behaviors of others. Predicting, he says, that's where my sensitivity comes in, he says it's a free option. You take a position about the future, you do an economic prediction, and now the whole country reacts to that prediction. They take you on face value. The governor of the Reserve Bank makes a certain statement. Everybody in the country reacts to that, but maybe the government of the Reserve Bank does not, in a personal sense, have skin in the game. So his final word is never ask anyone for their opinion, for their forecast, or their recommendation. Ask them, what do you have in your portfolio? And if you go to a doctor, then ask the doctor, what would you have done if you had a similar ailment than I have? In conclusion, I just want to make 3 remarks. He says, this is his thesis, that you cannot use history as information about the future. But when you've read the book, and you see how he's building his case, he is building his case on historical examples. Secondly, the question of bureaucrats and technology that only come by tinkering and economic growth that will not come from education, I think that has to be revisited. I'm not sure about his arguments. Some of the greatest progress in human history came from bureaucratic influence. My prime example of that is Kennedy said in 1960, I think Kennedy said, before the end of this decade, we will have a man on the moon. I say that was the best forecast ever made. They had a man on the moon in 1969. And surely they wouldn't have had a man on the moon by tinkering and by experimentation. And my last point about this is he builds a strong case for the scientific methodology of falsification. Never look around for things that will confirm your theory. That's no proof of anything. But the whole book, as you have just heard, is just a collection of examples of confirmation. So I think he, in terms of his own way of working, goes against the grain of his proposed methodology. Although I wouldn't dare telling him that. Thank you.